Hello, this is a short video on how to change the heads on the STC Combi Collector. Currently it's got the sweeper head in it, as you can see, and we're going to swap this over for the flail rotor, which can also be used as scarifier. So first of all, lift up your hopper using the hydraulics on your tractor back end or forklift. Lift the hopper up as shown and put some sort of piece of wood to stop it coming back down, and also it means you can unplug the pipe when the pressure's off. You can use this red stay here, which you unclip and then just fold it down. That will then locate itself in here. The only disadvantage is it comes down quite low before it gets it, but it will stop you from getting crushed. So that's what that's there for. First thing to do is to remove this guard, 13mm, and this gives you access to the belts and pulleys. Next up is the side skirts, and they need removing. They're also 13mm. This is so that you can drop the rotor out. Next up we have the bristle strip that runs along the front of the machine to keep the debris in. That's a 17mm. Next you remove the tensioner on the belt, which is done with a 19mm, and then you remove it completely by removing this 19mm nut here. Once you've removed the tensioner, you can then remove the belts once they're slack. So using an Allen key, you remove the studs out of these two holes. Once you've done that, one of the studs goes in this spare hole here, and that pushes the pulley off the wedge. So you do that up nice and tight, and that will push the wedge off. As you can see here, it might take a bit of persuasion, but once you've got that wedge released, this pulley is then loose, and the whole thing can come off the shaft. Once you've pulled the pulley off the shaft, put it back together and screw up the grub screws to keep it safe, and then obviously repeat the process on the other. Once your pulleys are removed, you can then move into where the rotor is, and either side there is a bridge bearing with a 24mm bolt that goes straight through, and that is on both sides, so you can undo those and let the rotor drop down onto the floor. You will find these easiest to do with a long reach socket, 24mm, and then on the top just use your spanner, and then you can ratchet using the ratchet underneath. When you have removed the rotor, the next thing is to lift the machine up so that you can pull the rotor out from underneath the machine, and then you're all clear to put the other head underneath. So here we have the flail rotor in front of the machine, and what we'll then do is lift the machine up and pull it up and over the head so it goes into position. Now you'll notice it's on a pallet, which is the best way to move it around, and make sure your long spigot is this end where the pulleys are, and make sure your bearing heads are this way up for putting the bolts through. So now we've lifted the machine up and over the head. It may help if you have two people, but make sure that your rotor spigot is lined up with this hole here, so when you lower it down it goes up into position correctly. And also on the inside, just make sure your bearing heads are still the right way up. Once you've located the fixings through the bearings and up with the nuts on the top, don't do any of them up, just locate them. And then once you've done that, lift the machine back up in the air again, clear of the pallet, and then you'll find it a lot easier to do the fixings up. There'll be more room to work. Before you store your bristle brush away, you'll need this keyway here, so take that off. Also give your bearings a grease and just grease these shafts so that they don't go rusty, and also make sure that it's sat up on something so your bristles don't bend over time. Next up is to fit the two pulleys back to the shafts. Now they're different for the flail. They take 3 belts instead of 2, and a few tips and tricks. Once you've fitted this keyway back in here, like you can see here, make sure the shaft hasn't been damaged. There's a slight burr on here which I've ground off. If you don't check it and there is a burr, you won't be able to get the shaft back on because it's a very snug fit. So first of all you put the pulley on with the holes at the front, then you put your wedge on locating the keyway correctly, and then that pushes onto the shaft. Once your pulley's on, you've got your holes lined up, you put your grub screws in, but don't do them up because you'll need to align it with the other pulley, and at the moment you can still move it backwards and forwards on the shaft like so. So again with the bigger pulley, same again, put some grease on the shaft just so it doesn't seize on. Put your big pulley on with the holes at the front, then locate the wedge onto the keyway. bring your pulley forwards and line up the 3 holes, and then just push it back onto the shaft, and then you put your 2 grub screws in, but again, don't tighten them up because you'll need to align it with the other pulley. Next job is to fit your belts while the tension is off. Once your belts are on, you then refit your tensioner, so you slacken the top nut right out, and it goes behind the belts and pulls them up. What you then need to do is tighten this up to tension them, and then you'll be able to refit the locking nut in there when the hole appears, and then you'll be ready to align your pulleys. So now your tension is all bolted on and secured, and the 2 nuts are done up there. You then need to make sure the pulleys are in line. Make sure that the belts aren't touching this threaded part here. Make sure they're in line. If you need to, you can tap them backwards or forwards, and then do up these Allen key heads here, which will pull the pulley into the wedge, securing it nice and tight. That will pull in then. Whilst the machine's up in the air, you'll find it a lot easier to fit this front rubber flap. These 2 brackets here locate either side of the PTO guard there on those 2 fixings and screw that up tight. So now that's fitted on, fixings done up, where the old one fixed to, just put the fixings back in the holes so they don't get rusted up. Refit your skirt underneath through them 4 holes while it's up in the air, and then you can refix your guard back on. Once your guard's back in place, replumb your hose up to the telehandler or your tractor. You'll need to lift the hydraulic to take your post out, and then you can lower it back down again.